Thank you very much. Yeah, Hans, thank you. Welcome on this webinar, and we are really looking forward to your presentation. And colleagues, thanks for all being here. There's so many. Of course, reflection on the future of wheat research for impact in the global south. It's super important. We had a very good talk with Alison yesterday, also taking over from Hans. It's very sad that we have to say farewell to him, but he promised us that he will stay an ambassador, because I don't think we have anybody in the organization that is so passionate as Hans. Although, to be honest, we are also that passionate, but Hans is very special, and also in the emotional way that he can convince other people also to become as passionate as he is. So Hans, we all in the files we have 37 years of commitment to CIMMYT from you. But you told me last week when I walked into your office, and when you were in your last cleaning up moments, which is always a very special moment. So it was good to be able to visit you in the office in this crazy Corona time, and to thank you also personally. But you have committed for 40 years, because you started 40 years ago already as a postdoc, you explained to me. So, yeah. And there's so many memories. We just saw yesterday that Obama wrote his book about his memories, but maybe we would be interested in your memories as well, and this seminar is by far not enough. The good thing is that you have been inspiring your scientists, your staff, but especially also the NARS, the national systems. I just explained also to the funders of the Crops to End Hunger, the breeding programs, that demand-driven approaches are important. And when there's one person promoting demand-driven approaches, listening to the national systems, listening to the small private sector, that's you. So, but also, you're responsible for the success of the technical direction implementation of the global wheat program at CIMMYT and the CGIAR research program on wheat. And we know that in terms of impact, I think it's the largest. Of course, wheat, maize, rice are the largest in general, but with 3 billion return, it's really amazing. 3 billion return just from wheat, or 3.5 maybe even, indicates already a return on investment that is interesting enough for the whole CGIAR investment. And when we add maize, it's almost a factor 5. So 500% return on investment that's basically going to the smallholder farmers. Now, Hans, you started your CIMMYT, your career here. But the numbers I got here is in January 1981. Many of us were not active scientists in those days. I was still a student, to be honest, and you joined as a postdoc in 1983. So we're very happy to have you had so long here and so committed. First, of course, been in Turkey for a long time, the winter wheat program that we have. But before I like to pass the microphone to Hans, I would like to say that wheat has a real bright future ahead. The donors, I just heard them, they are super committed in the whole portfolio of crops. And I think that also a lot of the knowledge and information that we have in wheat breeding programs and in maize breeding programs can be used for the smaller crops as well. So Hans, we keep in touch. Hopefully you will remain an ambassador. We will have a formal farewell, but we really look forward to hear from you, your wise thinking. And maybe 1 hour is not enough, and then maybe we'll find a follow-up there as well, because you learned so many lessons, and we want to make sure that we keep on learning from you. Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin, for this nice introduction, and also thank you very much for the channel interest. Yes, and it's true. My first visit to CIMMYT was on the 9th January 1981. And so basically, when I came to CIMMYT by then, I thought that this is postdoc, pre-doc time, and that's it. And then it turned out to become a lifelong marriage, as much as professional experience and commitment is. So I will present here my personal views, not CIMMYT and not CRP wheat, because I really think this has to be understood. I take the full responsibility. And let me talk at the beginning of what I am not talking about. So I want to emphasize it's extremely important. I will not talk about partnerships. Besides them, global wheat program would become obsolete anyway. They are the basis for impact. And I think CIMMYT has excellent relations with the national programs. The other point, which is paramount for wheat improvement, is free germplasm and information exchange. I am concerned about some developments in the moment, and I think that really needs to be watched carefully because that is the basis for wheat improvement. I will also not talk about seed and seed systems. That is, of course, crucial to reach farmers. And here the private sector will play an important role. I come back to the private sector and wheat improvement later. Then we need the enterprise breeding systems and data management. This is so paramount, and I think everybody looks forward that we get this program because we really, really need it. I will also not talk about potential of next generation technologies, GMO gene editing, because next generation technologies are current technologies tomorrow. So I leave that out. I will also not talk about specific traits in genetics, one wheat program with CIMMYT and gender and use. Once more, the reason that I don't talk about it, because I have some other messages and I only have 45 minutes, but they are all extremely important. And before I start now, let me make a short comment here. There was the report from CIRIS 2030, A World Without Hunger is Possible. And this was a report which was contracted by the Ministry of Technical Cooperation in Germany and the Gates Foundation. And they contracted Cornell, IFPRI, and the International Institute for Sustainable Development to calculate costs to end hunger by 2030. They analyzed more than 100,000 papers to identify the main areas for interventions. And as much as I know, I think Kevin was the representative from CIMMYT to contribute to this paper also. And what they came up with, and that's quite interesting, if the funding agencies would double their current investments, their annual investments, which are 14 billion, if governments in the South from domestic resources, the governments in the South would spend 19 billion from domestic resources, mainly through taxes, and the private sector another 50 billion, then it would be possible to end hunger by 2030. Is this a lot of money? Well, the OECD countries spend annually around $300 billion on market price support. I think that's a nice word chosen by the OECD economists to say subsidies. So if the world can spend $300 billion on subsidies, I think they could spend a few $billion on these priorities. But what was the most interesting thing for me was that this group, having analyzed 100,000 papers, came up with 3 interventions. Empower the excluded, and there the annual investments would be about $3 billion from the funders. Remember, the funders are requested to add a $14 billion, and that relates to social protection, access to credits, etc., education. Secondly, on the farm interventions. Intervention provided directly to farmers, including farm inputs, R&D, that's what we do, improved livestock, feed, and irrigation infrastructure. And thirdly, make sure that the food, the crops which are produced also reach the markets. So that has to do with transportation, with storage, etc. For me, this was really a wake-up call for the CGIAR because on the farm is our core expertise. And I think if 2 of the major funders and others will possibly join, come out with this message, I hope this is really taken seriously by the CGIAR and we are arrange our priorities. Now a few important facts about the global food security. I'm still talking about global food security because in spite of all the nice reports, we have the same number of hungry people than at the beginning of this millennium, and we still have 800 million people who are hungry, and I think we still have a big challenge ahead. So the first thing is, let's look at what our food is. On this slide here, you see the countries where wheat, maize, or rice, cereals are the most important calorie source. I can do the same for protein, and the map would look very similar. And what you see here, we have in Central Africa some other crops, mainly some root and tubers and cassava, etc. But on a global scale, our basis is cereals. And when we talk today that we should move away from this, realistically, we need to ask where would the energy then come from? And that leads to the next slide. And I think this is for me a key slide for priority setting. On the left side, you see these grayish countries. It shows you the countries where you can buy an energy sufficient diet compared with the international poverty line. And except for Peru and I think Panama, in all countries with the minimum poverty line of $1.5, you can get an energy sufficient diet. If we talk now about a healthy diet, then with the poverty line, the international poverty line, there is not a single country in the world where with the current poverty lines established by the individual countries, people who have this money available can afford a healthy diet. So I think there is some serious thinking needed and maybe also some political interventions to address this. It's one side to promote a healthy diet. It's another issue to empower the poor to buy it. And this really needs to be kept in mind because otherwise, I don't know where we will go. Another fact I would like also to remind the people who say there is too much wheat in the world. In this slide here, you see the blue dots where frost occurs during the wheat growing cycle. And more than 80% of the wheat in the world, about 160 million hectares, is grown in region where frost occurs during the wheat growing period. And we have very, very few alternatives of crops which provide energy or protein on a large scale, which can be produced on a large scale and be grown in these wheat areas. With other words, wheat is not only grown as a major source for calorie and protein, it's in many, many areas a biological necessity because there are no alternative crops available. Some of the vegetables are cold tolerant, some other cereals, barley, triticale, rye, but none of them would have the properties wheat has, and that's why it's very important to keep this in mind. Now, a few comments why wheat is really important. There were a lot of critics. This is a table from Dr. Pingali, the former CIMMYT economics director, who has argued strongly that the consumption of wheat has been declined over years. And if I look at these graphs here, to me it appears that the importance of wheat in the diet as calorie source remain pretty constant. What has changed dramatically is that people eat more, and that's part of the obesity problem, but the share of wheat, maize, and rice in the diets has basically not changed. And I don't foresee major changes because simply we don't have alternatives for maize, rice, and wheat are really cheap food sources. Then another point, which I think is very important for the future priority setting. USAID and IFPRI have looked at what is called the Nutrient Investment Productivity Index. What is this? They looked at all the crops here on the left side, and then they ranked them for calories, for protein, for vitamins, for micronutrients, for a lot of important components as food. And then they averaged it out, and then they said, okay, if I am a policymaker and I have to address malnutrition, I possibly should shoot for a crop where the tide goes up. It will not be perfect for all traits, but which one would be the best one to address malnutrition at a large scale? And you can see that wheat came clearly out as the number one. And there are reasons for this. Wheat, we know, is very important for energy. Wheat is also the world's most important protein source, and that applies to developed and developing countries alike. But wheat has many, many more components. It is a very important fiber. Most of us eat by far too little fiber, and also a very important source for nutrients, minerals and vitamins. And I think that over the next years, there will be much more investments required to really look at the options to increase these nutrients in wheat. And I want to make an important point here. I am not arguing wheat will be the solution for all our nutrient problems. By no means. We really need to push for a diversified diet and diversified cropping systems. But as long as there are 800 million hungry people out there who eat also wheat, and wheat offers an opportunity to address malnutrition, then investments in wheat improvement are highly effective and extremely cheap. And what I predict is that in the future, we need to do much more research on whole meal consumption, on whole meal products. It has a tremendous impact on many health factors. It reduces risk of metabolic disease, blood glucose, cholesterol levels, glycemic index. It has many, many benefits, but there are some issues on taste and acceptance. And for me, this should be really a top investment priority on a global scale, in the developed world as much as in the developing world. In the developing world, a lot of people already consume whole meal products like chapati. So there it's even less of an issue, but this really, for me, would be one of the top priorities for international research over the coming decade. And we also need to be very realistic. At CIMMYT, we have now a breeding program to mainstream zinc, which means that we want to incorporate increased zinc content into all elite lines. But based on several studies, peer-reviewed research shows that micronutrient deficiency is likely to remain problematic under all model scenarios through 2050. And if wheat, the micronutrient content in wheat can be further enhanced, and it can, that would be one way of reducing the impact of malnutrition of many poor people. Again, wheat is not the solution, but as long as we don't have the poor empowered and have given them enough money to buy diversified diets and more nutritious diets, wheat would be a very, very good intervention to raise the level of nutrients and therefore reducing the effect of malnutrition. Now, my personal top priority for the future is yield gap closure, because based on analysis from Tony Fisher, who for me is the guru on yield gaps in the world, the yield gaps are anywhere between 50 to 200% for various crops. And the way to address this is through genetics, agronomy, and policy. And this would mean focus on where is the biggest impact. And for the CGIAR, I also thought this would be focusing on yield gap closure and the related topics would be a big field to address for an 800 million institution. And I hope that is kept in mind, because if the CG does all what is currently on its strategy, we will be so thin on the ground that I don't know how we make the impact which is needed. So focus on where the biggest impact is. Now, what is the farmer's top priority? It is yield stability, and it's not yield per se. So there is predictable performance is more important than a few % extra yield. This really needs to be recognized and is very different from farmers in developed countries who will really maximize yield to maximize income. But for poor or subsistence farmers or smallholder farmers, yield stability drives the varieties they grow, and that needs to be kept in mind. Please also remember the average wheat farm size in developing countries is between 1 to 3 hectares. Farmers cannot afford a variety mixture to risk management. This is a common, if you grow 500 hectare wheat, well, you can grow 5 different varieties, and that will spread out the risk. Smallholder farmers cannot do this, and that's why they need stable varieties. And disease resistance is still the main driver for a variety replacement in wheat. CIMMYT's breeding strategy and testing has always been designed to develop lines with capacity to cope with environmental changes at one location over years. For me, the yield stability of CIMMYT lines is possibly the most important value of our germplasm. And that also needs to be kept in mind with all the discussions which are currently going on, that we diversify product development, etc. We need to maintain the yield stability in CIMMYT's germplasm. And I think if you look at this table here, these are the product profiles which have been defined now in the Accelerated Genetic Gains program. And we have a total of 6. We have optimum environment, heat tolerance, early maturity, drought tolerance, early maturity, and then we have 2 profiles for the highlands in Africa. But what I wanted to point out here, the yellow lines show the priority traits which are relevant across these environments. And I think, therefore, the breeding approach which CIMMYT is currently following has been so successful. With these traits are basically core traits. They have to be in most of the material. And these core traits then together assure the yield stability which farmers in any of these wheat growing environments need. And again, I wanted to illustrate, this here is the result of 50-year wheat breeding. The red countries indicate where sister lines have been released, sister lines of CIMMYT elite lines. And many are there who criticize and say, okay, CIMMYT is trying to develop one variety for the world. That is not true. But what it indicates is that we were successful in combining alleles which assure yield stability and disease resistance across these diverse environments. Also keep in mind, this is a belt. The wheat growing areas here is mostly in a belt between 30 degrees north to 30 degrees south. But it really shows here what has been achieved through the international testing, the global testing, the cooperation with the national programs who provided the data back, and over the 50, 60 years, we have recombined all these alleles. And to keep this allele package together is absolutely paramount. And that's why it is important that CIMMYT continues to distribute global nurseries. Some say we should distribute many more targeted nurseries. That is fine. But we need to have a nursery where we measure in highly diverse environments the adaptation and performance of our material. Because many times this testing shows us there is something in a given line. We don't know what the alleles are, but they are there, and then they can be put back into our crossing program. And I really hope that this can be maintained in the future. Let me now make another point, which is also extremely relevant. In this slide here, you see the yield progress of Ethiopia and India. And Ethiopia has made tremendous progress. If you look at this, I mean, in spite of there is a IFPRI paper which said, I mean, Ethiopia is not meeting expectations because they are below global average. Well, Ethiopia is approaching the global average, and I think they have done extremely well. But the point I want to make is a different one. Okay, if you look here at the trends in productivity of major cereals in Ethiopia, maize has gone up more than 212%. Congratulations, Prasanna. Wheat, 175%. Not so bad either over this period. But teff, barley, and sorghum are similar. And what this here clearly shows is that, again, we need to have inputs, we need to have varieties. It's the genotypes times agronomy and policy. And in Ethiopia, a lot had to do with fertilizer provision. I think similar miracles could happen in other parts of Africa. if they also would look into policies to provide inputs and make sure farmers have good seed. And then if you do this together, then you can make such tremendous increases. But without fertilizer, I do not believe, not I mean, many have shown, without fertilizers, it will be very difficult to produce enough food in Africa. And now I come to another area, and this is nitrogen fertilizer. And for me, nitrogen fertilizer would make a perfect big project in the CGIAR. What we see is that since 1961, the nitrogen application has increased 10 times, and the crop yield increased 3 times. Okay, this means our nitrogen efficiency went down, so to speak, right? Wheat receives more nitrogen than any other crop. About 19% of the global nitrogen is applied to wheat. In 2013, 80 million tons were applied in the developing world and 27 million tons in the developed world. And that indicates that the nitrogen use efficiency in the developing world is much, much lower than in the developed world. Interestingly, nitrogen use efficiency in wheat has not changed since the last study done by Oklahoma State University in 1999. It is still around 35%. And that means that out of 10 kilograms of nitrogen, 3 kilograms end up in the crop, 3 kilograms go into the air, and 3 kilograms go into the groundwater. And the estimated cost from nitrogen pollution, not only wheat, on all crops, per year is between $100 to $300 billion. And why is nitrogen so harmful? Nitrogen, if it's converted from ammonium into nitrous oxide, it has about 300 times higher capacity to absorb heat than carbon dioxide. So this is a major polluter, and it's a major contributor to global warming. And I simply do not understand why until today nitrogen use efficiency is not looked at a much more serious way than it is currently done. And as I said, I hope that the CGIAR really looks at this as a top priority. Now, another impact, and you can hear a key message from me here is that breeding is extremely important. Of course, I say this also as the Global Wheat Program Director, but we need to have the other interventions as well. And this here is, for me, one of the most fascinating examples for genotype times agronomy times policy I have seen aside Ethiopia. This is data from India. And what you see in the top row, the green dots show you the fields which were sown at a given time. And in the top left, I think, yeah, you can see this here in the top left. That was a picture from Punjab from October 16, 2017. And you can see very, very few green dots. Now, what happened was, in India, you could plant wheat earlier on residual moisture from monsoon, provided you can harvest the rice fast and provided you have varieties which can tolerate early heat. And what happened was that varieties have been developed which can stand early heat. They hold the growth back. And the happy seeder has been developed which allows to cut the rice and then direct seeding basically on the same day. And that has cut the window between harvest and sowing basically to 1 day. And this is the result why now so many farmers in India move to early sowing. The second point here is also the early sowing results in more biomass. And there are now varieties which can be cut in December or for fodder, because there is no fodder, and we have a second impact. But this was only possible because new varieties were developed which have the traits required. The happy seeder and the agronomic changes were implemented, and all of this is supported by policies. So this is where we need to look into these interventions if we want to feed a population of, well, 9 billion by 2050. The other area which is tremendously important is water. There is, these are trials from Obregon, and what was done here on the left, there was interval drip irrigation, and on the right, there was basically continuous drip irrigation. Every 7 days, water was provided. And what happened was, with the same amount of water, same amount of fertilizer, same amount of sowing date, the wheat with continuous drip irrigation was 13% higher and produced 10% more biomass. And that's why I think that there are options where we can tremendously increase the water use efficiency of our crops. And certainly drip irrigation is one of them. I mean, I say this for many years. At present, not economic, because drip is expensive, but if people have no water and they can produce the crops with half the water they currently use, then I think that will change very fast. And in India, drip irrigation is already explored in a very positive way. Now let me make about genetic resources. In this slide here, this is also a relatively old slide, but unfortunately it has not changed too much. The use of wild relatives in world collections. And you can see that on the right side, except for Agilobs, and these are the synthetics which were developed by CIMMYT, very, very few of the genetic resources are really exploited. And this should change. And the reason here is that translocations from rye, agropuron, and others have made globally an impact on performance and disease resistance. A huge impact. Half of the rust-resistant genes come from alien species. Many hybrids use one parent with a translocation, so there again are benefits. The currently biggest program on developing these translocations is the Nottingham University in the UK, and we really need to expand the cooperation, and the translocations developed by them should be transferred into elite lines on a large scale. And for this one, we can also use the breeding facility in Toluca, and I think we will have a big impact from this. Huge impact, but well, I think again, we need the necessary investments. Another area is also CIMMYT has the biggest gene bank, and we have by now more than half of the 160,000 accessions have been phenotyped for various traits. This year is done by Matthew's team for drought and heat traits, and what comes out of this year then, of course, we'll go into core sets, etc., for further evaluation. The physiology team then has to identify the traits, transfer them into elite lines, and that can then feed into the mainstream breeding program of Ravi, of Leo, of Boccia, Karim, etc., or our NAS partners. Okay, and this here is showing how physiology is approaching this by enriching the alleles in material. The yellow, the blue bar shows you the alleles, specific frequency in the crossing block, and the red one show you the frequency of these alleles in material developed, and there is definitely an increase, and that's why I think physiology pre-breeding is a very effective method to incorporate complex traits from exotic germplasm into elite lines. The big challenge still for many of these quantitative traits is to find molecular markers, but also there has been great progress made, and maybe also estimating breeding values will help in this aspect in the future. Now let me come at the end to a couple of comments on wheat breeding and some naive thoughts. Okay, first of all, I think everybody agrees that predicting grosses remains a challenge. We are getting better, but in wheat, due to the extremely big genome, please keep in mind the wheat genome is 5 times bigger than the human genome. And we have 3 genomes, and to estimate the interactions among the genomes remains a challenge, in spite of all the progress we have made. And I always quote my mentor, Dr. Rajaram here, who told me after he had worked with barley, durum, and bread wheat, he said barley breeding is easy because you can predict from the parents the performance. Barley is diploid. Durum is relatively straight. Bread wheat remains a challenge, and that was Dr. Rajaram said, who was possibly one of the most or the most successful bread wheat breeder ever, and it remains. Then we need to focus on reducing cycle time from currently 6 to 4 in 2 years. This is part of the new HGG. And we got a new $700,000 speed breeding facility in Toluca. So I think we are very well positioned for this. Breeding decision based on genomic estimating breeding values. I think that is an area where further improvements are needed if we have a realistic look. I have checked with many private companies, they all use GEV values, but all use it for discarding, not yet for selection. And this is exactly the experience we have at CIMMYT also, but I think there will over the coming years great progress made. And then we need to make sure that when we have now all the data, the molecular data, that this data really go out to our national partners. And CIMMYT has based a geneticist in India to work closely with Indian colleagues to fully exploit the potential of this approach. But I also want to emphasize, CIMMYT has a moral obligation to provide farmers the best varieties they can get. And we know that the shuttle breeding program has achieved this. And I really, really hope that the shuttle breeding program will continue until the new approaches which we are implementing now have proven that they produce equally good material, hopefully cheaper and faster. But in order to do this, we must have material tested in international nurseries coming from the shuttle and from the other approaches. And then the optimal breeding method can be developed, but CIMMYT cannot give up the shuttle until we know that other methods are equally good or better. Disease resistance. Current chemical protectives are routinely applied in developed countries with impact on breeding priorities and resistance. If we compare the genetic gains made in a breeding program like CIMMYT with many of the private sector companies, we compare pears with apples. I'm sorry to say it so clear, but many of the private companies really prioritize yield because that is what farmers look at, and they know that the varieties are protected with chemicals. CIMMYT and ICARA too has to look at a much wider range of diseases because our clients, the poor farmers, cannot afford chemical protectives. And that's why our varieties need to be resistant. And when we compare in the future genetic gains from private sector developed varieties with, for example, CIMMYT or ICARA, we should always include a trial without fungicide application, because then we also see what is there. 40% of CIMMYT ICARA wheat breeding efforts, investments go into breeding for disease resistance. It was always a must and it must remain. Now also, if in developed countries food safety and health regulation reduced or even forbid use of chemical protectives, I think the CGIAR wheat germplasm will be in high demand because we have the disease resistance and we have the yield potential. CIMMYT, through its global network, is also ideally positioned to new threats, for example, wheat blast or UG99. And due to the global testing, we have immediate information when a new threat emerges, and we also know which lines perform. So this preemptive testing is again paramount for future development. And many of you have seen this slide here, but I want to re-emphasize again, global phenotypic network for global wheat programs. It is and will remain a key component of wheat improvement. The phenotyping networks, as we call it today, we called it in the past key locations. But as long as we can maintain this and then screen what we cannot do in Mexico, verify performance in these locations, I'm sure that CIMMYT can continue to develop the wheat lines which combine all the traits which are needed to have an impact in farmers' fields. And I purposely put this slide here because I don't think anything can illustrate better how valuable CIMMYT's germplasm is. In this slide, you see the countries which have released CIMMYT-derived varieties. The red ones are direct introductions from our international nurseries. In blue, which are mostly the high latitude wheats, they crossed it either for yield potential or disease resistance. But with such an impact, I think this illustrates the power of the wheat model to develop wheat varieties, in particular for the developing countries. But I need to emphasize again, it is not CIMMYT. It is CIMMYT with the partners who evaluate the material, verify it, and share the data. And this, for me, is one of the highest, most important issues, criteria to maintain. Now, some wheat realities. The private sector has currently a minor role for wheat breeding in developing countries, and the public sector, including the CGIAR, remains the main provider of varieties. There are less than 5 breeding programs in the developing world which really do breeding, private sector breeding programs. A second point, which needs to be considered in the strategy of the CG, we need to be very realistic. On one side, there are arguments, CIMMYT, okay, you need to have breeding programs, you need breeders, quantitative genetics, pathology, physiology, molecular science, quality, nutrition, bioinformatics, statistics, etc., it's agronomic, etc., right? Now, in the 90s, Derek Byerly made an analysis where he looked, what is the minimum production or target area of a breeding program to generate sufficient income to pay for the costs? And by then, a full-fledged breeding program would need to target an area of 1 million hectare minimum or 3 million tons. That was mid-1995. By then, you could have a breeder and a pathologist and run a breeding program. Today, we need all this other expertise. So today, this criteria, these targets would be much higher. And maybe, Olaf, you can make a new study how much the wheat production needs to increase annually from what acreage to come up with figures which are meeting our 2020 scenario. And I think funders and policymakers need to recognize this and trust strategy and focus of investments in breeding. Now, wheat realities and the one CGIAR genetic gain strategy. When I read this, I'm again very pragmatic and realistic. All CG breeding programs for all crops have been analyzed with BPAT. BPAT stands for Breeding Program Assessment Tools. And most of the CG breeding programs are not at the desired capacity. CIMMYT maize and CIMMYT maize and wheat and Erie rice were, but most of the other programs were below the standard needed. Now, many NAS programs, not all, are even less strong than the CG breeding programs. Now, the CGIAR in its strategy foresees a future where the NARS capacities are tremendously increased, and that would allow sharing responsibilities between NAS and CGIAR. The NAS would focus on product profiles, variety development, testing, and field trials, and the CGIAR would step away from developing elite lines and focus on population development, traits, and parental lines. This is a model which functions well in Australia and West Europe, where the public sector does the basic research, trait, populations, etc., and the private sector, which are very huge breeding companies, take up these products and convert them into varieties. But I'm not sure how shall NAS take this responsibility without massive investments, and should all NARs push to develop this capacity. And another important point, in the CG strategy, the NARs have not been consulted as to what they want and expect from CGIAR breeding programs. And to develop a strategy with a clear understanding of what the NARs want, it is a little bit risky to push such a strategy. I mean, I say it very, very politely. Yeah. Okay. And this is the reason why I'm so worried. This is the latest study. It's only from 2010, but there is no newer available, on the share of global and public investment in agriculture R&D. And you can see that it's going down, and the bottom 80 countries are all going down. And unfortunately, with very few exceptions, there has no change in this trend. So if the national programs do not invest in strengthening their capacity, and funders don't come up with huge amounts, then we really need to realistically analyze what is the strength of all the partners of the national programs of the CGIAR to assure that we come up with the most efficient approach to provide the best varieties to farmers. Okay, now let me make a few points. Reality already is that could we talk to national programs, the medium and small countries, which may not be able to maintain a full-fledged breeding program, and formalize the current reality in which CGIAR is already the main provider. In many parts of the world, 70 to 80% of the varieties grown are CG derived. So India and China are the two biggest countries which can afford and have large programs, already invest in breeding at CIMMYT. And they are the ones who can operate huge programs. So would it be possible to convince smaller national programs also to contribute, and then all the germplasm would be openly accessible, all the data shared. We would have very close NARS CG interactions and expand the presence in the regions. And as I said before, we really should look at establishing regional testing and release programs. It is not possible that a country which grows 10,000 hectares of wheat can maintain a breeding program, but they can test the material in regional programs. And most developing countries strive for self-sufficiency, so competition by sharing germplasm should not be an issue. Regional testing provides more data and accelerates variety release. And the CGIAR provides early generation material traits, but also most important, elite lines for these testing networks. And if there would be a commitment from NARS and funders, the total budget for breeding would be allowed 35 million hectares. Is it naive? Is it unrealistic? Well, I think in the moment, but once we have another food crisis, priorities may change. And this is now the final comments. I think CIMMYT's global wheat program is really unique. No other breeding programs has a comparable impact by breeding from mainly one location. Other spring wheat breeding approaches in the private sector have not been more successful. Maintain, after one CGIAR is established, the global role of wheat. Really maintain the global program. Because the global wheat program should not be replaced with regional programs, because then the athletic blocks would be separated. They are the basis for yield stability. It would be in any case much more expensive to run breeding programs from several locations than from one. The logistics would be much more challenging. And defining and working now targeting TPs and product profiles should not prevent spillover of germplasm to other regions with similar environments. A global program can respond fast to new threats. But the most important, and that is my last message, it needs to be assured that maintain an open global wheat community that continues to share germplasm knowledge and information. For wheat, this is absolutely paramount, and for wheat improvement in the developing world, even more important, because if wheat becomes a protected crop, it may otherwise have difficulties to remain competitive, because wheat as a self-pollinated crop and hybrids may or may not come. Royalty systems not on the screen will not generate a lot of funds which the private sector then could invest in crop improvement. And so this is my last word. And with this one, I would like to thank you everybody for attending. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much for this very nice presentation. We have a discussion in the chat box, but we will. I will read one of the questions that we have received in the chat box. Just let me. It was moved. Sorry. Oh my God. Here, okay. Hans, thanks for your for nice insights. As you mentioned, maize production is increasing not only in Africa but also in South Asia. Do you foresee the potential of using both wheat and maize combined as a source of food energy? For example, in Pakistan, government is willing to develop a program of composite flour, wheat plus maize, with limited proportion, just to reduce the pressure on wheat. What is your advice?
Well, I think we have looked into this. I think Carlos and Natalia have worked on looking on mixing maize and wheat. And if we can come up with products which the consumer accepts, that makes a lot of sense, of course. And it also would diversify cropping systems. So, and some of the products I have tasted, they were okay to me. So I think there is a real potential of doing this, yeah. Pardon, I cannot hear you, Isabel.
No, I think there is another microphone open. There is a great discussion regarding fertilizer. There is one question from Dr. Victor Comerel here. Just me. Okay. What are the chances for leapfrogging with respect to fertilizer innovation? What, how, logistics in African countries?
I didn't understand the first part.
Sorry. What are the chances for leapfrogging with respect to fertilizer innovation? What, how, logistics, and so forth in African countries?
Well, I think this is a good question, but I think it really seriously needs to be looked at to have more fertilizer factories maybe. But the other thing is also that fertilizer in Africa, in many countries, is prohibitive expensive. And maybe governments need to look into providing, subsidizing fertilizer more. Ethiopia was able to do it. And so I think other countries need to follow. But I mean, there came many studies out of Wageningen, for example, which clearly showed if Africa does not apply fertilizer to the crops, it will be very difficult to do. So there, I would say these are large-scale interventions which need to be done maybe or even on regional level, at national level. But Africa cannot be kept away from fertilizer in the future. And this is, okay, we need to find interventions. I don't know what interventions exactly, but I know if there is no fertilizer applied, the growth of any crop is not very good. And this is not rocket science, this is a fact. So how can we address this? The average nitrogen application in Africa is below 10 kilograms per hectare. I mean, okay, I mean, that, I think that says enough.
Thank you. I would like to open the microphone for any intervention from the audience. We have very few minutes, so we can have someone from the audience that would like to intervene directly. Otherwise, I can. There is one more question here. Well, there is a discussion. Is it possible to develop hybrid wheat variety? Is there any plan of CIMMYT regarding hybrid wheat?
Okay, excellent question. Okay, I didn't go into this. Yes, we had a hybrid program, a very good hybrid program with Syngenta. And we had a hybrid program in the past with Monsanto. in both cases, the progress made was good, but the private companies changed strategies, and that's why the program in with Syngenta was closed. We were at a stage where we had CMS-based hybrids for testing. So unfortunately, we had to stop. But CIMMYT was very interested. We also participated in a multinational consortium led by BASF using transgenics to produce hybrids. Unfortunately, that consortium never took off. But CIMMYT was interested in looking into hybrids, yeah, and we had good hybrid material, but we stopped it because the funder stopped.
Thank you very much. I would like to give the microphone to Dr. Martin Croft.
Martin Croft.
Thank you.
Let me try to get in. Yeah, okay. Hans, super. As always, super inspiring. And I want your slides, please, because we are on all these discussions in the CGIAR and a lot of relevant things. Now, the discussion on molecular breeding, we started already, and we will follow that on with Alison, because I've seen, of course, the numbers and the data so far that we have. We have to be very careful that when we start designing new approaches, then don't throw old tools away. You new ships are not yet there. Somebody has to switch.
Somebody could mute the microphone.
Pradeep, can you switch off your microphone? Pradeep, sorry.
Pradeep, can you turn off your microphone?
Otherwise, Isabel, you can mute him. Okay, so but basically, yeah, thank you. Hans, a lot of information in here. Now, one thing I didn't realize, stupid for me, that indeed, because we are breeding for resistance, basically, because we don't use the chemicals, I thought maybe are there farmers using organic farming? Are they using our varieties in Europe and things?
Because no, because our material is not exact. They use it as parents for crossing, but they will not release it because of the high latitude and much is winter wheat, etc. But they use it for crossing. I mean, we know that a lot of the companies in Southern Europe use it heavily, and also in the northern, but mainly as parents. But again, this is information. Then we don't get what was crossed, but they use it. I mean, that we know.
But it's very important for all of us to remember that we are basically preparing also the world to use less pesticides in that sense. It's a very interesting one. I will keep that in mind also when promoting the program. Now, a second question about the NARS, or a remark. We just had a meeting with all the donors of the Crops to End Hunger, all the breeding donors. They are excited about one big breeding program for the whole CGIAR. Gary had a discussion yesterday with NARS DGs from Africa, he said. So let's also make sure that we are demand-driven. And that also connects to Matthew's remark and question to me. With the TAC 2, we delivered at the August 1 our draft strategy. We planned a complete analysis of stakeholder meanings and opportunities, yes, and thoughts that didn't work out so far. And I keep on pushing the EMT that they come out with asking the NARS and to make it all demand-driven. I also explained to the donors, and Gary directly and others directly agreed on this. We have to make this whole CGIAR agenda demand-driven, and that's what you said, Hans, as well. Now, one thing in relation to this, basically on the NARS. You say one program, and we discussed it many times, and I really have seen how well it is done, and that's really super. But would, for example, more than one program, it doesn't have to be 40, that's crazy. I fully agree on this. But just to make sure that you have enough diversity when things happen, completely new pests or diseases come in. Wouldn't it be more stable and more resilient globally if we would have more than one of those programs like what we have right now?
Okay, that's a good point. I think as long as we maintain the diversity, and that was always a key component, exactly, in germplasm, I think CIMMYT was paying more attention in one program to maintain diversity than if many programs use all the same gene. I know one country in Europe where currently all varieties grown, developed by different companies, have only one gene for yellow rust protection. So more programs do not necessarily mean more diversity, but I mean, that could be looked at. And in CIMMYT now, we have developed the 6 product profiles, and I think that will be an opportunity to look for the diversification. But at CIMMYT, we always were extremely concerned about understanding the basis of our disease resistance to exactly avoid what you mentioned here. And as I said, many programs, as long as they don't use different sources of resistance, does not mean more diversity. I mean, that is a perception which many have, but that does not necessarily hold true.
Hans, thank you so much. I have to move to the Cargill award session. I have to give a speech there as well. I'm so sorry. But let me, maybe other people still have some questions, but let me thank you so much on behalf of all of us. You're one of our heroes, and you will always be that. So we will have a farewell later on, but please keep on sharing your thoughts, because we need people that high level think about what's happening. And also what you say about the 3, I say the same thing already a long time. 3 things are necessary. Good varieties is 1, good agronomy is 2nd. I've been trained as a farmer by my father-in-law. And then good governance is the 3rd one, because, for example, without good governance, there will be no fertilizer program for Africa, and it will never happen. We all know this. And thank you so much for also looking beyond and further than your own program and only breeding, because that's what the world needs. We have to think from a farmer's perspective, and that's what you'll be doing. So the take it to the farmer is also written on your front hat, I think, in that sense. So thank you so much on behalf of all of us. Stay in touch, and many of us will keep on connecting with you, because it's not for nothing that there is something like right now 174 people online, Hans, all listening to you. And let me give an applause to you on behalf of all of us, and then maybe Isabel can take it further. A big applause, please.
All right, thank you.